And we begin with a Fox News alert on the first charges filed in the Russia investigation, with President Trump's former campaign chair now indicted and awaiting a court appearance. Good morning. I'm John Scott.
Big news day this Monday. My goodness.
It is a big one.
Wow, we have a lot to get to. I'm Melissa Francis. Paul Manafort surrendering to the FBI today. He is set to appear in court less than 3 hours from now after a federal grand jury indicted him on 12 counts, including conspiracy against the U.S. and money laundering in the special counsel's investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 election.
This was expected, I think, over the past several months. If you asked anybody who is following this Mueller investigation closely, the one thing they all agreed would probably happen would be that Paul Manafort would be indicted. And as a matter of fact, over those months, a number of people in Trump world have told me that they expected Manafort to be indicted. So that fact is just not a surprise.
We have also learned of a second case. This is Trump aide George Papadopoulos pleading guilty to making false statements to the FBI agents investigating the Russian meddling in the election. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts is live with the story. John.
And Papadopoulos was a foreign policy advisor to the Trump campaign, was hired in the spring of 2016, was an unpaid position. Like a lot of these foreign policy advisors that the Trump campaign brought in, he had suggested to the campaign, according to the information, that he had connections that could get a meeting with President Putin and then candidate Donald Trump. Apparently, the Trump campaign at every step rebuffed those entreaties. So not sure where Papadopoulos is going to go. Manafort seems to be the bigger issue right now because he did serve as the president's campaign manager for some time, campaign chairman for about 3 months' time, was wrangling delegates before that. We're not going to see the president in person until later on today when he has Halloween here at the White House, but the president is weighing in on the charges brought against Paul Manafort and his business associate on Twitter. The president saying, quote, "Sorry, but this is years ago, before Paul Manafort was part of the Trump campaign, but why aren't crooked Hillary and the Dems the focus? Also, there is no collusion." Manafort was reportedly under investigation by the FBI since back in 2014 for his connections with Ukrainian officials, also reportedly under a wiretap after being approved by a FISA court. If all of that is correct, the president's former campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, has a real issue with that, as he explained on Fox Business just a short time ago. Listen here.
If the public reports are true, and there was a time where Paul Manafort was under a FISA warrant before coming to the Trump campaign, why is it the FBI never reached out to me as the campaign manager, never reached out to Donald Trump and said, look, you might want to pause for a second and take a look before you bring this guy on board as a volunteer to hunt delegates for you? They never did that. He was under a FISA warrant supposedly both before and after his tenure at the campaign, and the FBI never notified the leading presidential candidate for a major Republican Party race, never notified him of a potential problem. This is a problem with the FBI, if you ask me.
Top Democrats are also weighing in on the indictments this morning. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer saying in a statement, quote, "The president must not, under any circumstances, interfere with the special counsel's work in any way. If he does so, Congress must respond swiftly, unequivocally, and in a bipartisan way to ensure that the investigation continues." Sources familiar with the matter say that the president has absolutely no desire or intention to interfere with what Mueller is doing. The people who are on the president's legal team feel very good about where they are in terms of the collection of documents that Mueller and his team have asked for. And the White House has told us many, many times, Melissa, that they believe that this investigation will be concluded in short order and will show no collusion on the part of the Trump campaign or on the part of the president with Russia. They feel very good about where they are. So they believe that it's in the president's best interest to allow this investigation to proceed, to come to a swift conclusion. We will hear on the record this afternoon from Sarah Huckabee Sanders during her afternoon briefing today. And by the way, one other little announcement coming out of the White House today. We can expect that a choice of the Fed chairman, the new Fed chairman, will be announced here at the White House by the president on Thursday. Janet Yellen, we understand, is out of the running. Jerome Powell is the leading contender for that, so we'll see where that goes. Melissa?
Interesting. All right, John Roberts, thank you.
Thank you.
For more on the Manafort indictment, let's bring in Larry Sabato, director of the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia. I've been through the indictment, 31 pages of it, looked at it fairly closely, Larry. I do not see the name Trump anywhere in the indictment. When the president says, he tweeted out this morning, that this all happened years ago and doesn't involve his campaign, essentially, is he right?
Well, you're correct that the name Trump isn't mentioned, and Paul Manafort has his own problems, and I don't think anybody would want to be him this morning.
Right.
Look, we don't know what the Mueller team has and what they're going to do, and basically they've been pretty leak-proof. I kind of think the leak about these indictments came from the courthouse and not from the Mueller team. So we'll just have to see how it unfolds. The president is convinced that there was no collusion. And he feels that very strongly. He's tweeted it out. I'm sure his lawyers have told him to say as little as possible. If he says as little as possible, if he doesn't have any preemptive pardons, then I'm not going to say he's free and clear, but he's in a much better position than he would be otherwise.
Yeah, it's not something that you want to have happen, have your former campaign chairman indicted by a special counsel.
No, it's not a welcome development. You always ask yourself, what does the constellation of events look like? The best piece of news that is continuing and appears likely to continue is a very strong economy. And short of an unpopular war, even a big scandal won't derail a strong economy. So if that's the ace in your hand, then don't play a two-card, right?
Right. Well, the other intriguing thing is that a former Trump campaign aide, George Papadopoulos, has been charged with lying to the FBI. We don't know exactly what this is about. It's the timing, extent, and nature of his relationships and interactions with certain foreign nationals whom he understood to have close connections with senior Russian government officials. It's kind of almost an afterthought here, but is it possible that there is bigger trouble for the Trump campaign there?
Look, there might be. You know, he's 30 years old, as I understand it, somewhere in that vicinity. So he was under 30, I guess, when these things happened. It's hard to believe he had that much influence or was that senior. And I'll be honest with you, and this is no cut to him, it's a cut to me, but I'd never heard of him before this indictment was announced today. Now, lying to the FBI is never a good thing. If you're in trouble for any reason, the first thing your lawyer tells you is either don't say anything at all, or whatever you do, don't lie to the FBI. That is really the beginning of deep trouble for anybody. So obviously he's pled guilty, so he's admitted that he is guilty on that. We'll see whether that leads anywhere. I simply don't know. Well,
once again, the indictment for Paul Manafort involves money laundering and failing to register as a foreign agent. So it's a long way from there to any collusion with the Russians during the course of business in the Trump campaign. But there are some troubling new numbers for the president that we wanted to talk about. The Wall Street Journal NBC News poll finds his job performance hitting a new low, dropping 5 percentage points from last month. He's now at 38% approval. 58% of those surveyed say they disapprove of the job Mr. Trump has done in office. Those numbers similar to a Fox News poll, which also put the president's approval rating at 38%, 57% disapproving. He's been in office less than a year. Are these worrisome numbers, Larry?
John, they're not good numbers. They really aren't. You want to do whatever you can to increase your positives if you're a president in the first year, because you have a lot of challenges ahead. Having said that, and having all of us remembering what happened last fall with the polls, let's say two things. The next election is more than a year away, and the next presidential election is 3 years away. And 1,000 things can happen between now and then. And second, we've learned with Donald Trump that whatever his numbers in these polls are, add 3, 4, 5 points, just as we found out last fall. Why is that? Because a certain number of Trump supporters simply don't talk to pollsters, don't want to talk to pollsters. It's called non-response bias. And I think there are also hidden Trump voters who will say they're undecided or refuse to say one way or the other who actually are supporters. So his support level is actually higher than it appears in most polls. Now, does that put him at 50? No, it puts him maybe in the low 40s. He got 46% on Election Day. So they've got work to do, but they also have time to do it. And again, the economy is very strong. That's what most people look at first. Then they get to the other things. Now, the president would help himself if he stopped generating side controversies. You know, those things are just not helpful. You know, in a way, he'd be better off just issuing a press release daily about the latest good number on the economy.
One of the issues that's going to come up for this White House, the former senior advisor Steve Bannon and his push against incumbents and the prospect of President Trump actively campaigning against some of those Republicans during the midterms. Now, it turns out, Larry, that move is not unprecedented. FDR actually actively campaigned against some Democrats back when he was in the Oval Office.
Yes, he was very, very angry about Congress rejecting his court-packing scheme and doing some other things that he didn't like. So he took out after some Democrats that he felt were insufficiently supportive of him. And FDR, as you recall, was about the strongest president in the 20th century, was elected to the presidency 4 times. What's important to note here is he utterly failed. He completely failed. So he didn't purge anybody.
The strong, the bully pulpit, the power of the presidency, and it effectively didn't work.
It didn't work, and it drained energy and capital from things that were much more important to FDR's agenda. There's a lesson there for President Trump. Now, Steve Bannon is outside the White House, and maybe he's not controllable by the president or anybody else. But for the president himself, there is a lesson in the history provided by Franklin Roosevelt.
Larry Sabato, University of Virginia, Center for Politics. Larry, thank you.
Thanks, John.
Former Trump campaign chairman and a key aide surrendering to the FBI this morning. What's in the 12-count indictment against Paul Manafort?
These charges against Paul Manafort and Rick Gates suggest that Bob Mueller has even bigger fish that he's hoping to catch here.
A Fox News alert, former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort slapped with a 12-count federal indictment, including conspiracy against the U.S., money laundering, and failure to disclose foreign lobbying. This breaking news coming after months of investigation by special counsel Robert Mueller into Russian election meddling. Former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper said this in a Politico podcast. The Russians succeeded, I believe, beyond their wildest expectations. Their first objective in the election was to sow discontent, discord, and disruption in our political life, and they have succeeded to a fairly well. They have accelerated, amplified the polarization and divisiveness in this country, and they have undermined our democratic system. Let's bring in our panel on that. Joe Concha is media reporter for The Hill. Judith Miller is Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, author, and Fox News contributor. All of this news obviously just broke, but there are a couple of things. Casual observers of the news, I suppose, Joe, are going to say, oh, the president's former campaign chairman is indicted. Clearly, there must be Russian collusion in the Trump campaign. That's not in this indictment at all.
No, it's not, and the president pointed that out in a tweet that he sent out about an hour ago, saying this is from years ago. This has nothing to do with our campaign. Obviously, the campaign was 2015, 2016, and this goes back far before that. And I think what you're going to see now is what we've seen over the last year or two when it comes to Democrats and Republicans and observers of news, which is one side will just be entrenched and say there's nothing to see here, guys. Hey, what about Hillary Clinton, by the way? And what Chris Wallace said on this network on Friday, which was, and I quote, there's more evidence at this point of Democratic collusion with the Russians than there are of Republican collusion with the Russians. Chris Wallace is pretty respected in this business. So I think that holds right now, that one side will just say, hey, what about Hillary? And the other side will say, hey, there's a lot more coming behind this Mueller indictment.
And what about leaks, Judy? Because somebody leaked the fact that this indictment was coming before the weekend began.
Oh, John, we are shocked that there are leaks coming out of Washington. I mean, come on. A lot of them come from the White House itself. But I just can't believe what Joe's saying, because evidence of collusion, why would Hillary Clinton collude with the Russians to get information out that hurt her own campaign? I mean, this is ridiculous. This is a distraction. It's a sideshow. The fact of the matter is we have not only the former campaign manager and an assistant being indicted now, we also have a statement, an acknowledgement from George Papadopoulos, who is apparently a low-level but foreign policy advisor to the president, acknowledging that he met with a Russian professor who had ties to the Kremlin, who was offering him dirt, and he lied about that to the FBI. That's not alleged, that's acknowledged now. So let's just wait and see how this investigation plays out, and let's not draw any conclusions until we see how it plays out. But certainly to say that Hillary Clinton, who is not president, who was not elected, was colluding with a campaign to undermine her own campaign, just doesn't make sense to me.
The New York Times is reporting that George Papadopoulos, the young former Trump campaign aide, who also has been indicted and entered a guilty plea to lying to the FBI, that he supposedly met with this Russian professor, saying it was a meeting about Moscow giving dirt to the campaign on the Hillary Clinton campaign. This according to the court documents that just came out and as reported in the New York Times. I suppose, Joe, you know, there could be there almost certainly are other shoes to drop here. But again, just the fact that this Manafort document doesn't really involve anything that he did during the campaign, that's what the Trump White House, what the campaign is taking pains to point out.
Right, and I want to commend, by the way, Judy and you for pronouncing Papadopoulos correctly. I can't wait to see the stumbling on that. But just back to what Judy said before, the reason why Hillary Clinton is relevant here is because we have proof that the DNC and the Clinton campaign paid for by a foreign national in Christopher Steele, MI6, to get information from the Russians. And anybody who's a Trump supporter will say that is far worse than anything we're seeing with Paul Manafort right now. So I don't think it's so ridiculous to bring up Hillary Clinton. I get she's not president, but the argument can be made that there is more evidence of Democrats working with Russians than Republicans working with Russians at this point.
And, Judy, the fact that we are still talking about this, talking about Russian meddling and who did what 7 months after the president took office, illustrates James Clapper's point. You know, the Russians want to sow discontent among Americans with regard to how our electoral process works.
Well, I think that is aided and abetted by the White House itself and by President Trump's tsunami of tweets trying to distract the American people from his real failure in terms of getting any part of his agenda through. And we'll see what happens with the tax bill. He has lots of Democratic buy-in, or some Democratic buy-in of that. But, you know, I think there is another aspect of this, what's happened so far with the Manafort indictment, and that is that it makes it very, very hard for Donald Trump to fire Robert Mueller, which is something that was rumored in Washington he was contemplating. And it also makes it very hard for the president to pardon Paul Manafort, because both of those would smack of obstruction of justice. I think it's a political red line that the president isn't going to cross, or may not. Who knows what Donald Trump will do, but I think it makes it harder for him to do that.
It was rumored, John, that he would fire Mueller, but he has said on the record, I believe just last week, that that wasn't going to happen.
All right. Joe Concha, Judy Miller, thank you both.
Thank you.
NFL protests.
Live from our Los Angeles bureau with more on what led up to all of this. William.
Well, John, the controversy is about a comment, 8 words, made 2 weeks ago by NFL owner Bob McNair, who owns the Houston Texans. He said during a closed-door meeting with other owners, and I quote, "We can't have the inmates running the prison." Now, a majority of Houston players assumed McNair was referring to them as inmates, and on Sunday, 40 of them knelt during the national anthem in protest and explained why after the game.
We came together as a team and wanted to, send a message, and that's what we decided to do. And I'm going to stand by my brother, do that.
There's a lot of emotions, a lot of emotions running for our team, but just a huge sense of unity. I think that we all felt, just coming out, making sure, playing for each other, and then that was it.
But the 80-year-old McNair says that is not what he meant. He apologized publicly and directly to the team for, number one, using a figure of speech that was never meant to be taken literally, and two, that was not directed at the team. And I am quoting, "I was not referring to our players when I made a very regretful comment during the owners' meetings last week. I was referring to the relationship between the league office and team owners and how they've been making significant strategic decisions affecting our league without adequate input from ownership over the past few years." Now, as for that sentiment, McNair is not alone. Cowboys owner Jerry Jones is also reportedly not happy with Commissioner Roger Goodell's handling of the national anthem controversy, the Ray Rice affair, and two teams relocating to Los Angeles. So, John, the question is, do you believe McNair's story? And if not, is what he said so offensive that he should be punished as called for by Jesse Jackson? Texan players say the episode isn't over. Back to you.
We're going to keep watching this controversy. William Lajeunesse from Los Angeles, thank you.
The push for tax reform, why some Democrats say they're being left out, and how that could impact the overhaul on Capitol Hill.
I think most people believe the tax code is hopelessly broken.
I think what's most important to my viewers is ensuring that America remains a country with its own voice, its own traditions, its own history. I've learned a lot from the Fox audience over the years. They can cut through the clutter. They can spot a phony a mile away. Most people, when you push past all the left-right nonsense, will come at issues from a pragmatic stance, and that's what I'm going to do. Do not even think about missing the Ingram Angle, premiering tonight, 10 p.m., Fox News Channel.
Right now, there's new fallout from the deadly ambush against U.S. soldiers in Niger. With Defense Secretary Jim Mattis and Secretary of State Rex Tillerson getting ready to testify before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, just after Tillerson announced the U.S. pledged $60 million more in counterterrorism funds for Niger and neighboring countries. Lucas Tomlinson live at the Pentagon with that for us. Lucas.
John, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee gets underway at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, where lawmakers will be demanding to know why it took 2 full days to recover the body of Sergeant LaDavid Johnson after the ambush. Late last week, the Pentagon pushed back, saying he was never left behind.
What are reporters getting wrong on the Niger ambush?
I think the thing that they got wrong was that we abandoned one of our soldiers. As the chairman said, there was always someone looking for Sergeant Johnson.
Defense Secretary Mattis also said no troops were left behind. U.S. officials later said American, French, or Nigerian forces were always looking for Sergeant Johnson amid fears he had been taken captive. His body was later discovered by Nigerian forces. A U.S. drone was sent overhead minutes after the attack, but too late to spot the 50 heavily armed militants approaching the American Special Forces team, returning to their base in Niger on October 4th. Lawmakers also want to know why it took 2 hours for French jets to appear overhead and why it took the ambushed troops an hour to call for them. U.S. forces in Africa have long complained about the lack of air assets. Now, the subject of this hearing this afternoon is to review the Pentagon's authorities to strike terrorist groups using congressional authorization given days after the 9/11 attacks. But since then, terrorist groups like ISIS have emerged, and the global war has spread beyond al-Qaeda. This year, the U.S. military has dropped bombs in 6 different countries: Libya, Somalia, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Afghanistan. The Pentagon is also pushing back on any restraint on its forces based on time or geography, something some lawmakers on both sides of the aisle seek today. John?
Lucas Tomlinson. They call it a global war on terror for good reason. Thanks, Lucas.
So just in on the battle for tax reform, with one Democratic senator saying she wants to be involved in the overhaul, but that members of her party are being left out.
I want to work with them. If we can make this about the middle class and make this not trickle down, but deliver to the middle class and small businesses, then I think they could get a bipartisan vote on this, and that would be so much better for the country.
Joining us now is Richard Fowler, Fox News contributor and radio talk show host. We also have Gianno Caldwell. He is a Republican strategist, Caldwell Strategic Consulting, and a Fox News political analyst. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me. So if you should start with what Claire McCaskill has said, because I want to focus on what's new this morning and what are the points that seem to be up for negotiation as we get started here today. She was really focused on that pass-through tax that lowers taxes on people that own small businesses. You know, if you have a family-owned business or you have a real estate brokerage or something like that, lowering your taxes so that you can create more jobs. She thinks that's a tax on millionaires and billionaires. What do you think, Richard?
Well, I think Claire McCaskill brings up a good point, right? This is how important it is for Democrats and Republicans to work together to get this tax reform bill done. The last time we've seen tax reform done was 1986, and that bill was introduced by a Democrat in the House of Representatives and signed by Ronald Reagan the following year, that October. And so I think if we're going to get real and true and lasting tax reform, it has to be a bipartisan effort. And it can't happen overnight, Melissa. It's going to take a long time. Remember, in 1986, Democrats introduced it into the House that December. Ronald Reagan didn't sign it until that following October. So it was almost a 10 and 11th month time frame to get it done.
So
Let's not rush this.
It could take some time. Gianno,
let's slow it down and get it done right.
If Democrats want to get involved, the talking point that we're hearing from them, you know, this morning and yesterday has to do with that pass-through tax. Is that the thing that they want killed, do you think?
You know what? Democrats have flip-flopped on this issue more times than Gucci sandals at a pride parade. It's really discouraging to hear them complain about issues like this. You talk about tax reform or any legislative issue when during Obamacare, they didn't allow Republicans in to negotiate. Matter of fact, Nancy Pelosi famously said, if you want to know what's in the bill, we have to pass it first. So when I hear these kind of things, which I consider to be complete and total lies, because we know that in New York State, the New York delegation, Democrats and Republicans are working together on issues like the property tax. There's compromises that are moving forward that Democrats and Republicans are talking about. So for her to complain only because she wants to get involved, because she knows that Trump won her state, and she wants to be able to say, look, I work with Republicans on something like this, and we know that tax reform is going to get done anyway. This is the reason why I believe people like Claire McCaskill is speaking up.
Okay, Gianno, for the record, Gucci sandals at a pride parade, I don't think that was appropriate. Let's not do that again. Okay. Richard, let me ask you about the second point that seems to be in focus this morning, and it has to do with this idea. Bill Hemmer asked Peter King earlier today about the idea that it looks like some folks are actually getting their taxes raised through this tax cut, and that's not really the Republican thing to do. Peter King said he wouldn't vote for a bill that raised taxes on his constituents. Obviously, they're talking about those deductions for state and local taxes. What do you think of that fight?
Well, I think that's the hard part of this bill. So you have Republicans like Peter King who live in states like New York and are from states like New York, also Republicans from Maryland, Republicans from California, who are in a really tough position because when you get rid of that state and local tax deduction, it's going to hurt their constituents because they have a higher local and state tax rate. And so this is what puts Republicans in a conundrum. And I think to add to that, you have new moves by Paul Ryan and others to get rid of the homeowner deduction, so people who claim their mortgage interest rate as a deduction on their tax return, they want to take that away. And so there's a lot of Republicans who are very nervous about that, and the National Builders Association and the National Realtor Association are saying this is a big deal. So this is what makes tax reform so complicated, because we're working off of a 3-decade-old tax law, and when you decide to throw the baby out, when you decide to throw the bathwater out, you find out there's a baby in there, Melissa.
But
and
Gianno,
that's what makes this complicated.
What makes it really complicated, though, is it's kind of like, I heard someone say the analogy earlier today, it's like taking blood from your right arm and putting it into your left arm, the way that they're trying to keep it revenue neutral. And so you do have to raise taxes on some people to, quote, pay for it somewhere else when you're not accounting for the growth that cutting taxes could create. So it does seem like somebody's taxes are going to go up as a result, and that's, you know, is that what Republicans stand for?
No, it isn't. And Melissa, I'd like to apologize. Certainly, I didn't mean to offend anybody with my reference there. But certainly, there are folks, like you say, in New York State, which pays about $48 billion more in taxes than what they actually receive in services. So there's a lot of folks that have the potential to be disenfranchised by it. That's why there's been people like Peter King who has said that, look, I am not going to vote for something that's going to disenfranchise my constituents. And as I referenced earlier, with Democrats and Republicans working together on this particular issue, which I believe there are compromises to be made, because Republicans, of course, we want to make sure that everyone receives a tax break, not just higher income earners, if that be the case, or middle class, but everyone actually sees some benefit from tax reform, as Richard mentioned earlier, which hasn't been done since 1986 under the Ronald Reagan era. That's why this issue is so important, and we have to work together to get it done. And I disagree with Claire McCaskill, because I think Democrats and Republicans are working together to get this done.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot to do. We got to go, and we haven't solved it here, but hopefully they'll solve it in Washington. Thanks to both of you.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Well, the first indictments unsealed in the Robert Mueller investigation. Paul Manafort, former Trump campaign chairman, will soon make his initial appearance in court.
The government has amassed a very sophisticated case against him.